It's my great pleasure to introduce my friend and colleague, Dr. Jennifer Jurado, Chief Resilience Officer of the Broward County, as well as Deputy Director of Environmental Protection and Growth Management Division. Dr. Jurado, the floor is yours.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Steve, and to the audience for sticking with the program through this afternoon. What a panel to follow. I would have preferred to have gone much earlier, but it's exceptional work. I hope to be able to impart something of the same level of excitement with some of the work that's taking place here in Broward County, and to acknowledge how a regional study like this really helps to inform the next scale of work that we need to see undertaken at the county level. And so very briefly, I want to share what's kind of been the county's own path towards a more robust resilience strategy. As we've all seen the evolution of information, tools, studies, and so forth that can help inform our process. Next slide, please. And so this has been a learning process, as we've seen quite a bit in the way of a changing landscape over the years, noting an increased susceptibility, of course, to some of the most pressing of impacts, which have been that of flooding. So I don't want to understate any of the other elements of climate response, but I do emphasize here the acknowledgement that the flooding challenges of the last decade have become so very prevalent and exacerbating that it's really necessitated an organized response. And so as we think about the changing landscape, redevelopment decisions, land use proposals, where do we put infrastructure? How do we design for that infrastructure? How do we meet water management requirements, both water quality and quantity, as part of our development decisions? What are the new elevations that we need to build for? These are all the types of questions that we know are lingering, that are reinforce the adaptation strategies that the team just discussed. But then you really look at what does it mean in terms of the detail, in terms of how you design that infrastructure and what implementation looks like. Next slide, please. So this has been a learning process for us, as we've started with some of the more preliminary types of tools, the bathtub models, early sea level rise projections, and we've seen the adjustments with time. And through that course of evolution or learning and the advancement of science, it's helped to kind of refine and form some of the scenarios we've looked at. We've had the benefit of really capitalizing on more robust hydrologic models that we've continued to develop in our county to support the resilience standards that I'm going to share in the next several slides. So next slide, please. So one of the very first investments that we undertook was out of a priority planning area map. And we understood this to be a fairly simplistic early approach, but in the absence of the more robust models, we were looking at just the bathtub level analysis. And we adopted in 2012 and 2015 a map that delineates the areas at increased risk of flooding with 2 feet of sea level rise, earlier projection. We're now in the process of updating this map. That is the basis for the more kind of resilience-oriented review of land use proposals that come through the county's process. It's also the tool that we first used to look at our own capital projects requirements and consider those that need to be kind of subject to a more future conditions assessment. So we are in the process of updating this map now for the 3.3 foot sea level rise scenario, consistent with the sea level rise projection just adopted by our board earlier this year, the compacts projection. Next slide, please. So as we undertook this work, the next phase of our efforts focused on that drainage. And very early on, we were, in the last 10 years, seeing and hearing anecdotally more of a challenge of flood management, sluggish systems. We knew that the table was rising. The next step in our process was to model that future change in sea level and its impact on the groundwater table. We were able to advance in 2017 and update to our requirements consistent with the predicted change in water table with 2 feet of sea level rise, and we're currently in the process of working with the USGS to update this model and map to now reflect 3.3 feet of sea level rise. Next slide, please. The next step was our work with the Army Corps of Engineers. We knew that we were experiencing a great deal of high tide flooding. There was no consistency in standards in terms of tidal flood barriers and seawall heights. This study evaluated the future coastal water elevation with sea level rise, high tides, and high frequency storm surge. We were able to finalize a recommendation of 5 feet NAVD as a consistent top elevation for coastal tidal flood barriers. That standard was adopted earlier this year by the county, and the coastal cities now have 2 years to put an ordinance in place implementing this particular recommendation consistent with the land use plan and county code. Next slide, please. So these efforts help to address the rising groundwater table and water that's coming in from the coastal area, but we know another source of flooding is out of that intensification of rainfall events. Over this last year, we've worked with Geosyntech and are now finalizing our future conditions flood map that accounts for sea level rise, the rise in groundwater table, and a 13% change in rainfall intensity that came from downscaled global climate model analyses. And we're now finalizing an updated flood map that reveals the more expansive extent and change in flood depth with the future conditions 100-year storm. This will just be one of the tools that's utilized for setting finished florations and helping to site infrastructure alongside with site-specific modeling and our FEMA flood maps. And we use the highest of those elevations to establish that required finished floor. Next slide, please. And so that takes us to the next phase in our process, which is we can anticipate this change in water level, but we don't necessarily want to inherit that. And in addition to mitigation efforts over the next several decades, we'll need to plan for this additional water. So I'm pleased to share that we're in the process of procuring services that will aid us in developing a countywide resilience strategy that will seek to organize redevelopment strategies, water management strategies, basin level approaches, green infrastructure, and to bracket, identify the costs associated with the improvements, as well as quantify both the flood reduction benefits as well as the economic advantages that are gained through the risk reduction, kind of building on the work of the regional report of AECOM. With that, I will conclude. And I did want to take one other moment of privilege. And in this next slide, please, if we could oops, I'm having a problem with an alarm here. And if I could just have one more slide, please. I wanted to take a moment of personal privilege and make an acknowledgement that the compact and all, with all my peers, we would like to take a special moment to acknowledge the grand contributions of a very prominent individual in the compact's history, and that is Steve Adams, with whom you've all had the benefit of chatting throughout the day. Steve became familiar to many of us as he was working in the administration of Governor Christ at the time here in Florida. And even before we had any sense that we'd be working together as a region, we were all seeking conference with a really dear friend who had an incredible aptitude for collaboration and policy, and was so insightful thinking about the wisdom that he could share as we were all struggling. And as we began to kind of formulate strategies for the future, Steve was one of the organizing forces that helped bring together, along with our leadership, the strategy of a compact that could serve as the foundation for the work that we've all enjoyed today. And he's just been a passionate partner. He's a dear friend to all of us and highly admired. It's hard to think about any one of the accomplishments over this last decade or more where Steve hasn't had a very notable role. And I know that he is leaving ISC in just a couple of days. Undoubtedly, he will impact other communities in the same way, or nationally at the state level. Wherever he goes, we know that there are many others who are deserving the benefit of his talents. And so on behalf of all of us who are partners in the compact, I'd like to give a special note of appreciation and gratitude and best wishes to our dear friend and colleague, Steve Adams. Thank you,
Jennifer,
Steve.
I am grateful. Thank you so much for the kind words. Thank you all for the opportunity to venture along this journey with you. You all have done all of the hard work, the heavy lifting. It has been a supreme privilege to be with you as you have taken the kernel of an idea and made it flower in so many ways, really and truly.
Thank you, Steve.
Thank you.